Welcome back, everybody. Let's see, I saw a number of you in office hours to tell me about the many, many wonderful applications that we'll be making. There were quite a few of you that I didn't see, so we need to figure that out. I have a phone meeting at 6 today, so if you can, well, I guess there's something going on at 6 today, so some of you will be taking off, but we need to figure it out. So as far as, I'll get to you in a second, Tom. As far as this thing goes, it's not like, I'm not grading you on your project idea or whether you give me this document or not. It's more to just make sure that you've chosen a project that's appropriate in terms of difficulty, especially, you know, some folks have come to me with stuff that's way too easy, and it's hurt me to turn you away to tell you to go find harder stuff, but that's just how it goes. And then some folks have come up with like things that are way too difficult, which is much easier. You know, it's easier to cut than it is to add stuff sometimes. So if you didn't get me something, email it to me, because our first milestone, if you haven't looked at the news group and the description I put up, is this Friday. So you know, take a look at that document, email me something as soon as possible, and yeah, the sooner the better, because we've got 5 weeks from today. So yeah, so next 5 weeks we're working on apps. Maybe I'll work on one too if I have some time. We'll see. Tom, you had a question.
So I spoke with Ken and got approval from him, so I could be all right.
That's fine. Just email me the thing so I have a record of it. So we have a record of it all in one place. And then I'm curious to see what you're going to do. So, yes?
Just about like finish with the project as far as releasing it to the App Store. Also with like who, like the university, do they own any kind of intellectual rights to it? Or?
No, we're not going to worry about that at all.
So
we won't even mention. Okay. The answer is no, they don't. We're not going to even mention that. In these bad budget times, they scrape for every dime they can get. If they find they're going to make 35 cents out of the App Store, they decide to try to change the rules. I find with these things, we just won't even discuss it. Okay. Go ahead and do our thing.
Yeah.
You know.
So, but you know, I think so. You brought something up in office hours, and I'll address that aspect of it, which was, you know, at the end of class, it's time to submit these apps to wherever, and you are, you know, you're free to submit them through the university program, in which case they're all free and they go up and, you know, they're available. The other option is, you know, you start your own company and you apply for the developer program. You know, you pay the $99 and then you submit it and charge whatever it is that you feel like charging. And I'm getting a feeling that there are a lot of people in here that want to do that. So either at some point we're going to have a talk about business stuff, and you know, here's how to set up a business. And it's either going to be me doing the talk, or if I can find someone at the business school who's much better qualified than I am to do that. I mean, I've been through it a few times, but we'll see. So does that sort of take care of kind of some of your concerns? Okay. Other questions? Tom?
Just one thing. So if we go the route that you said before, which is pushing out to the university program, will we be able to update it later on in the future with our
So I'm not sure exactly how the program works once it's up there. So I don't know if, so I know I'm set up as an admin, Ken is set up as an admin, and you guys are set up as team members. So as team members, I don't know, well, there's another component, iTunes Connect, which is the place where you actually submit stuff. So I need to look at that and figure out how that part works as far as students and all that goes. So once I figure that out, I'll let you know, and we'll definitely figure it out before December 4th when folks are ready to submit stuff. Which by, yeah?
There's some of the dates on like the provisioning profiles and stuff, and they all expire.
Music service low.
Oh, do they really expire now? Okay, so that might be our answer right there, because if the provisioning profiles expire, then you can't do various things, but I'll take a closer look and see. So any other? So a quick comment from me, like the stuff that I'm seeing people, the applications that they're suggesting, they're interesting. So I'm looking forward to seeing this stuff actually working. The one thing which I don't know if I've really said directly, but polish is going to be very important. So, while programmer art is great, I prefer not programmer art, especially for the App Store. Let's try and have something that look at the applications that Apple has made and the aesthetics that you see there or you experience when you're using them, and try and sort of head in that direction. There are a number of folks working on games. Games, it's hard, right? You have graphics and things that need to be visually pleasing. And today's lecture is actually going to be on 2D game programming with Cocos 2D, so that should hopefully get a bunch of you off and running. What I will suggest in terms of artwork, a style that seems to is sort of in vogue in the App Store right now is this very hand-drawn, well, it is hand-drawn. So people just draw some characters and they color them in with not even within the lines, but with colored pencil or crayons, and they just scan them into Photoshop and play around with them in Photoshop and then make whatever images. So, that's an option. Other options, of course, head over to the art school. There's got to be somebody over there who wants to help, pad their portfolio, and they might be able to help you with icons and various artwork. And there are also a bunch of places online where you can access royalty-free images. Other places like iStock Photo where you can access stuff for a fee. So, start looking around and seeing just, we don't want programmer art. We want stuff to look good and solid and professional. And at the end of the day, that's going to help you out when you land that first job or whatever it is, or sell those first million apps that you're going to sell. And then you're going to buy me a beer or whatever. So, okay. Any other comments? If not, we're going to dive into Cocos 2D. And yes.
Something about
yes. Thank you. So I want to put together some sort of something where we all get together outside of the classroom, off campus. So that's either going to be at Sudworks or at my house, I don't know, wherever we can figure it out. And I know Ken has some info, or maybe Ken's house, yeah. So someone should see either Ken or I at the end of class, and we can figure out how to do some stuff to get some cash that will help us fund this thing. So I don't know, anyone have any preferences in terms of when to do this? I prefer sooner than later, but like Friday? Saturday? Is that too soon, Ken? Too soon? Okay. So we'll try to plan something from essentially 2 weeks, maybe. Yes?
I missed that question. What's the point of what you're talking about?
Oh, the point what I'm talking about is trying to get us all together to hang out outside of class and just...
Team building thing?
What's that?
Just a team building thing, or not really?
No, just get, many of you already know each other, many of you don't. So these are the folks that, 5 years from now, you're going to walk into an office and someone's going to be interviewing you, and it's going to be the person sitting next to you. And, might as well know each other ahead of time. So, it's just to get out of the class and kind of hang out. So we'll figure that out. I'll put something on News Group. All right. One more question. Yes?
Slightly off topic. I assume that this ILM meeting was somewhere?
Yes. ILM is coming today. You should go hang out with them and see them in that room at 6 o'clock if you want to go make movies and do stuff. Ken had something more to say about it, I think.
Ken through the Career Center meeting, and I found out about it yesterday.
Okay, I was just wondering, because I hadn't heard anything. I was just wondering what list am I not on?
And I got an email that said, we want a really big turnout tomorrow. And I said, well, it's nice to give me a date notice.
Okay, next 5 weeks we're working on apps, and there will be lectures as usual. So, there's going to be stuff that we'll be covering that hopefully as we go might just be that little thing like, oh, I didn't know that was there, and I'm so glad that we discussed it today or whatever. So, there's just a lot of stuff to cover, and being 5 weeks into the class and now 5 weeks where you kind of get to run off on your own, definitely there's a ton of material we haven't covered. We could probably spend 3 quarters and still not cover everything we'd need to cover, but okay. So today, Introduction to 2D Game Programming using Cocos 2D. So this is actually a talk I gave at a conference that week that I was gone. So we had a lecture and then I was gone for a week and then I came back. So the conference was 360 iDev, and it's happening again in April. If you can somehow ditch classes and go, and if you're totally into iPhone stuff, I highly recommend it. A lot of the people that I talk to and interact with on a somewhat regular basis are people I met at this conference. And so 360 iDev. And also at the end of, that conference, I posted a little blog post thing saying, here are the slides. If anybody's interested in a screencast, let me know. So this is me fulfilling my promise. So it helps you guys out because you get to learn about this game engine, and it's me, sort of fulfilling my promise to provide a screencast since this is all being recorded and stuff. Yes?
Where is that?
The conference this year, so in April, will be held at, I believe it's eBay's headquarters in San Jose. And so close by. Last one was in Denver, which was awesome. If you have more questions about it, just ping me later and I'll tell you all about it. Yeah. I don't remember the dates of what the new ones are. So right now they're also they're open for paper submissions and talk submissions. So if you have something that you're ready to talk about when it comes to the iPhone, submit it and then they'll cover the cost. And so that might be nice. So I got to think of something to talk about. We'll see. Okay, so quick overview. So we'll take a look at why would we want to use Cocos 2D. We're going to spend some time on the beginner hurdles because these are the things that you're going to face, as soon as you go home today and start messing with this. Rough estimate, maybe it'll save you 5 hours, but it might save you 10 or more hours after. It's like super lame stuff, but we get stuck on it, so we'll get you over that quickly. We'll look at sort of the basics behind this engine, some more specifics. We'll go through some samples and tests, and then I'll have a few slides where you can see some of some resources, some links to places. So this will probably be, I think this will be the most slides I've had for any lecture, and that's because I prepared these like forever ago. But we'll do some of the usual where I dive in and we'll go through code and see how things are done once we get to the samples and test stuff. Okay, so why Cocos 2D? So first off, well over 200 games have shipped with this engine. So it's, lots of people have been using it and, ferreted out various bugs that you won't have to deal with, hopefully. Licensing is very liberal. It's an LGPL license with a little extra addition for the iPhone. So basically that means you can use it and do whatever you want to do with it. The hope is, of course, that if you make changes to the engine itself, you submit those changes back to the community. And again, they're very liberal. You get to decide what you think should go back and shouldn't. So tons of features, all sorts of stuff with sprites and particle systems, and their integrated physics engines. The community is extremely active. So I took a snapshot of the forums this morning at like 11:30, and I don't know, there are tons of things going on I guess something had just been posted within a minute of when I had taken that screenshot. So tons of people always on there, very helpful, and it's interesting to see like some of the things on the side there. AtlasSprite Manager, I don't know if you can see them, but anyways, we'll be talking about some of those things. So those are some of the forum topics that were sort of hot today, I guess. And then, so the other thing, in terms of why Cocos 2D, and I had a lot of people ask me this at the conference, so I put this little slide, this little bullet in, which is, what's your business? Are you in the business of, are you in the business of making money? Are you in the business of making game engines? are you in the business of making games? So if you're looking at making games, then you don't want to take the next month building your own game engine. And this thing is, there's tons of code here. There's a lot of stuff that's already been implemented for you. So, if you're going out and trying to do some middleware thing where you want to sell engines, well, then I guess you wouldn't want to use Cocos 2D because, you're making your own thing. So I like Cocos 2D a lot. I think it's pretty straightforward to use once you get into it. At the conference, a friend of mine, Noel, set up something called is iPhone Game Jam, where that evening, I guess we spent basically all night long working on games and stuff. And there were a bunch of people who had never done any game programming who attended this Cocos 2D talk, and then they made a few little games. So. Actually, I think if you check out iPhoneGameJam.com, you'll see some of the stuff that's there. Okay, so when I gave this talk, it actually took me 1 hour and 20 minutes. So right now, we've already used up the first 20 minutes of class, so we've got an hour. So I'm going to go, and we'll see. So first up, some of the hurdles. Objective-C and memory management. People have issues with that. Actually setting up a project that uses Cocos 2D tends to be an issue. And then just running these samples and the tests, people run into various weird things with that. And then actually just understanding how the tests are set up is kind of weird at first. And a lot of this sort of ties into the fact that a lot of people coming over to Cocos 2D, not only is Cocos 2D new, but Objective-C is new, and all the memory management stuff and all the tools you're using, all that stuff is new. So for you, I'm going to say that it's still new. We've been looking at this stuff for 5 weeks, but when it comes to Objective-C, you've already learned a bunch. If you haven't, we're not going to get into any more of it now, but if you haven't read this document or don't know about it, check it out. It's in your developer documentation. It's on the web as well. So Learning Objective-C, a primer. That'll give you a quick intro to a bunch of stuff, and then there's some more specific documentation as well that you can dive in more. And then the memory management aspect of it, we've discussed it a bunch. NARC, new, alloc, retain, copy, and then when that happens, you release. Read this document, and you'll get even more info on it if there's anything weird about how this stuff works. And you'll get these slides and all that today. So actually, they're already on the web on my website. So okay, in terms of actually setting up a Cocos 2D project, this used to be somewhat of a pain. As of a few releases ago, or at least a release or so ago, it's now super easy. On the terminal command line, inside the tarball that you get with all the Cocos 2D stuff, just run this script, sudo install template sh, and it will install some of these little templates that you see up here. So it sort of adds some things to the pre-baked Apple templates, and then the two that you will get they're the two in the middle. One of them is just Cocos 2D application. The other one is Cocos 2D that uses Box 2D. So I mentioned that Cocos has a lot of features, and some of the stuff that it doesn't have, it sort of brings in. And in terms of physics engines, there's two of them that it incorporates. One of them is called Box 2D, and you would use this template to sort of help get you started quickly using that. Another one is called Chipmunk. I have not really used either, but some folks were talking about physics stuff and wanting to do wacky, cool things. So, yeah. So when you choose, say, that middle template that I've chosen there, you'll get sort of the usual stuff, but specifically, you'll get some, the Cocos 2D sources. So there are a bunch of things you have in here. The first one, Cocos Live. 1 second. Cocos Live, if you want to manage high scores and keep a server online, Cocos Live will sort of help you do that. There's some other services now that have sort of popped up since then, where so one of them is OpenFaint. So I have a friend that works there, where you can basically keep track of high scores, and then just some other social networking types of things. But as far as Cocos Live goes, you can push scores to the web and then have them displayed for other folks. Font Label, Touch JSON, I haven't really used. You can look into them and see what they're about. Cocos Denshin is a sound engine that the library incorporates. If you want to do some sound stuff, you might want to use that. Take a look at the license. It's slightly different. It has a different license than Cocos 2D itself, and it basically just says, hey, if you use Cocos Denshin, then you should let the world know that you're actually using Cocos 2D, and you should go ahead and make some sort of donation to the project. So the person, like one of the main people, or the main person behind this is this guy in Brazil, and I think this is all he does. He works on this, and the way he makes money is, people contribute to this project, and then he sells source code that shows examples, like more in-depth examples of how to use this stuff. So something to keep in mind. Don't be afraid of giving back to the community. And as soon as I ship my first game that will use this engine, I'll definitely kick back some cash to these folks because it saved me a ton of time. And then, of course, Cocos 2D, that's all the sources that are related to this thing. So as far as running the samples and tests, well, it's weird because the samples, it's just a great source of examples, and it seems like tons of people don't realize that they're there. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen in the forums someone says, hey, can I do this or that? And usually it's like, hey, go look at the samples, and you have exactly the one little tiny thing that they were asking about. The problem is once people realize that the samples are there, they then run into some issues, and they get this weird stuff where things just don't seem to work. And Blake, you had a question that, okay. So, you'll end up with this thing, you're like, why doesn't anything work? Why does Cocos hate me or something? So, so let's take a look at how to run them and, where they are and how to run them. So first off, in the tarball that you get, you're going to get an Xcode project. And I guess it's probably tiny to see, but it's cocos2d-iphone.xcodeproj. And inside there, you'll get a bunch of the stuff that we just saw, but there's this directory with tests. So inside there's just tons of tests and examples. And to actually run them, so it's not that big of a deal, they're here, but to actually run them, you have to do something that most of you probably haven't seen yet with Xcode, which is, right now most of your projects have had one project inside there. What you can actually do, or one executable, what you can actually do is have multiple targets. So think Makefiles, and then think of Xcode as sort of this really nice front end to Makefiles. And a lot of the concepts from Makefiles, like targets, will make sense. So you can have, so in order to run these, you have to make sure that you set both this active target and this active executable. And because of some wacky bug in Xcode, sometimes setting the active target will set the active executable for you. Sometimes it won't. So you just have to make sure that it's set it for you, and then you'll be fine. So the way to set the active target, and you've all seen this in the upper left-hand corner, you've got that drop-down where you can choose various things. Well, in this case, the active target I've chosen, that selected one there is this Excel viewport test, whatever that does, who knows. But I've selected it, and what you have to do then is you just have to kind of, keep scrolling down. This list is super huge, and eventually you will reach the bottom of those targets, and then you'll reach the active executable section. And there you just have to make sure that, in this case, Excel viewport test is also selected. So super easy, but again, people run into issues, and I've seen a number of things on the forums where people ask, I can't get these to work, and it's usually because of this. Yes?
So we actively select the Excel viewport test from just the regular design. We want to make the executable.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, but this is basically about so someone's written some code that that's pretty much its own little app. It is its own little application, and there's just tons of little applications that you could run in this project. So setting the active target and the active executable is how you make sure that when you hit build and run, that the things you've selected actually run. Okay, so the tests. Something very important to know about the tests are not games. It'd be nice if they were, but they're not. They are there to exercise some very, very specific functionality. The nice thing is that specific functionality is quite likely some very specific thing you're trying to figure out how to use. So right now, if I was to use Cocos 2D for some specific thing that I've never used it for, so some people mentioned they want to write side scrollers. I've never used Cocos 2D side scroller stuff, but I'm pretty sure there's some tests in there that will show me how to use some of their parallax stuff, so you can get like that, you know, that cool effect where it looks like things in the background move slower than things in the foreground. So, you know, I would dive in, look at those tests, see how they do it, and then do the same thing, or some variation on it. So all the tests are structured very similarly. You're going to have some sort of base test class that's going to do sort of some setup for you, and oftentimes that setup will generate this little control that I have here with this left arrow, right arrow, and the little button in the center. And what that will let you do is, so there'll be this base test class that will sort of set things up for you, and then there'll be a number of different classes that exercise some specific thing associated with this test. And you'll just sort of cycle through those. And as you cycle through those, what you'll end up doing is this last bullet I have here, which is you'll end up instantiating new tests. So I guess you'll have these classes that represent some sort of test. And as you move through the arrows, you will instantiate new tests using something called NSClass from string. So we haven't really gotten into a lot of the really magical and fantastic stuff that Objective-C can do. But it's a very dynamic language, and one of the things you can do is at runtime, you can feed your program a string, and assuming that string, there's an equivalent, there's a class that exists that happens to have the name of the string you fed it, you can actually create that class. And that's sort of how they do this, and we'll look in a second when we look in the tests, but basically you give NSClass from string, a string like my favorite class, and it will then return you the class. And then you can do all sorts of stuff with the class, like allocating objects and doing things that you're usually used to doing. So let's take a quick look. We won't really look or worry about what these tests do, but we'll just look and see how they're sort of set up. So we'll look at AtlasSprite test and Ease Actions test. And my machine is not happy. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so let's see. I said AtlasSprite test. So, right, you'll see this thing here. You go into tests, and so let's see, AtlasSprite test. So actually, so first, let's do this thing where we set the target and all that. So AtlasSprite test. And it's sort of taking a long time, and when it does that, it makes me think like it. Usually I know that it's set the other thing as well, but let's see. And so our active executable is set, so great. So let's see what this test, just to see what it does. Okay, so AtlasSprite, looks like I can click and do some things, and then now I've got some animation thing, I've got some opacity color thing going on, Z order. So one thing I didn't mention is Cocos 2D sits on top of OpenGL. So one of the things that, for a lot of the games that people were talking about, I don't think you're going to have to worry too much about some of the performance stuff, but in general, it's important to know what your engine's sort of doing under the hood. So just know that OpenGL is hanging out under there. Okay, some other things you can do. So it's a 2D game engine, but because we're using OpenGL, we've got all sorts of 3D stuff available to us. So in this case, we've got this thing going on. If you're curious about how do I rotate my sprite, which is just this little image around various points, this particular test might be helpful. So let's look at the .h for AtlasSprite test, and the things that are important. So in terms of what we're talking about is, so I mentioned that most of the tests are going to have some sort of base test class. In this case, it's Atlas Demo. And then we're going to have a bunch of other tests. And I'm sorry, I forgot that we're in... we need to go into giant mode here. So we have this, some sort of base class, and then we have a bunch of other classes that just inherit off of it. Atlas 1, Atlas 2, Atlas 3. And basically, as I was clicking those green buttons, it was just cycling through these guys. So if we look at the implementation, at the very top, what you're going to see in pretty much all of the tests is sort of this setup where you're going to have this array of NS strings, and Atlas 1, Atlas 2. So all of these names happen to correspond to the class names that we just looked at. Atlas 1, 2, 3, 4, Atlas Z Vertex. So like I was saying, at runtime, when you click those little buttons, it's going to cycle through this list and grab the string, call that thing that creates our class for us, instantiate it, and once that happens, it's pretty much just looking through the code. So usually the way that ends up happening is eventually this thing next action gets called, and basically what it does is it's incrementing this scene index counter, which is just something that's just going to be used to cycle through that array up here, this transitions. And all it's doing here is basically, if I've wrapped around, then just make sure that when I hit the end, I sort of start over again at 0. Yeah, so grabs the string, creates the class from that string, and returns it. And so next action, that's sort of, say we're going forwards. Back action does the same thing, except we're now decrementing. And then restart just restarts from, restarts the current test. So that's that button in the center. And so let's take a look at how Atlas Demo is set up, and then we'll see how it sort of links into this back action and next action thing. So Atlas Demo, basically, so we have this initializer, same usual stuff where, tell our parent to go ahead and do whatever initialization they need. We won't worry about some of this other stuff here, but basically the stuff that you saw on screen in terms of that control all comes from this code here, which is basically, and let's look at it one line at a time. It's basically, menu item image. So basically they're creating a menu, and the way to create that menu is you give it the name of the image you want to use, in this case b1.png, and then b2.png if what the image looks like when it's selected. So button up, button down type stuff. The button looks different when it's clicked. And then the target is self. So basically, when that button is clicked, send a message to self, and send that, the message that you're going to send it is this callback. So the other 3 lines do the same thing, except one is now the restart callback, the next one is this next callback. And basically, to actually build the menu, you just feed it each of these items that we created, and you terminate with a nil. So let's look at, say, the next callback. Okay. So basically what's happening now, you've got that thing running, you've got those green buttons, you press on one of them and say it happens to be the next callback. It's going to create this thing called a scene, and we'll discuss that shortly. And eventually the part that's of interest is this next action. So we saw next action basically increments some counter and grabs a string out of this array and creates the class. So at this point, next action, we have our, we've been returned a class, and what we end up doing is we're calling this method, or sending it this message called node. And what this is going to do is node is actually it's going to allocate this node thing, and because we're not calling alloc or the usual things, if we want to do anything, we'll probably want to retain it, but we'll look at that stuff later. So yes, so that's that. We'll take a quick look at ease action just to see that most of the tests are set up pretty much the same way. And actually, before I do that, let me head down to the very bottom where everything gets started. So we should have our usual, our application did finish launching. So, whenever you're looking through code and some application, this is generally a good place to start because you know that this is where you kind of get your first hooks in. So we won't worry about some of the first few things that get started or set up, but eventually we'll get to a place where we see something that, like what we just saw, where we had some sort of class and we create a node, or where we have this next action that returns us a class and creates a node. So this pretty much, this is sort of that first step in to the test. And from here, anytime someone clicks on those buttons, you'll kind of, you'll just go through and, so say, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here with some stuff, but so we saw that base class, right, that set up this menu thing for us. And then probably the first, so say this is one of the tests that when you're clicking next, it returns you this Atlas1 string, and that gets, you get that class. And at some point when you allocate it or you send it, you try to initialize it. Well, so in this case, this is where the test will actually do its thing. In this case, it's creating an AtlasSprite Manager, whatever that is, and we will talk about that. And basically, what you could do is, you can set a breakpoint here, and now you can just start to see, okay, well, if I'm interested in whatever Atlas1 is doing, you can walk through here and check it out and see what's going on, assuming it's something, assuming you're interested in knowing what Atlas sprites are about. So let's look at ease actions test, just to see how this one is set up. Hopefully we see something similar. So we have some class Sprite demo. It's it looks like there's some things that it needs that are probably going to be common to all tests. And then we see, okay, well, it's got a Sprite ease test, a Sprite ease in, ease out, and to see what this is, again, we can set our active target and make sure that the executable is also set. Again, it's taking a while, so my guess is it grabbed it this time. But let's be safe and see. Okay, it did. So ease in, ease out. So you have some animation stuff where you can sort of control how it moves. And you've got some other things where the rate changes over time. So again, we have that base class and some other classes that inherit off of it. I expect to see a big list with the different, with those different strings up here. So Sprite ease, ease in, ease out. And then those same things, that next action that's going to basically grab one of those strings, get a class from it. And then, again, that Sprite demo where it basically it does whatever setup it does that seems to be common to all of the other tests. This should look pretty familiar from that last test, which is just setting up that control. And, so let's look at one of them. So Sprite ease, in terms of the implementation, and we can look at the various things that are associated with that particular test. So I will leave that for the tests. And next, let's actually look at the Cocos 2D basics. Like what the heck can we do with this thing? And sort of how are things structured from a very high level. So basically, I guess sort of a very rough analogy that Cocos 2D uses is sort of this idea of theater or of movies, where movies have scenes, and these scenes have props, and those props, you can think of them as being layered, or there's backgrounds, and you kind of layer them on top of each other, and then there are these actors, which generally you can think of them as sprites, or they're called sprites in this system, where they're just these things that they're characters. So in terms of Cocos 2D, the game has scenes. Each scene has some number of layers, and then usually what happens, these layers, they contain sprites or your actors, and they capture the user interaction. So when you click, it's on these layers where you capture these touch events. And then you have this director that manages the scenes, and sort of how do you transition between them. So the scenes, you can think of the scenes as the screens in your game. So one way to think of them is that each screen is sort of like its own separate little app, which is not a big leap from what we've been looking at in terms of, say, that last homework with the RSS reader, where each screen was its own controller. You can almost think of it as its own little tiny app. As long as it's got the data that it needs, it can do whatever, that very focused thing. So I'm not sure how easy it is to read this, but here we have this little graph of some potential scenes in a game. So maybe when the game starts up, there's some sort of intro where you're introduced to the character and is running around, or whatever it is that goes on during an intro. Eventually you're presented with a menu, and from the menu you might start the game, and when you do that, you move to another scene, which is the first level, and maybe you beat the first level, and you get some sort of cutscene or some sort of in-game cinematic thing going on, and then eventually you're at level 2, and then you suck, so you end up losing, so you get this losing cutscene. Or you might be at the main menu again, and you want to look at the high scores, so your high score screen would be another scene. So we've got scenes, and then scenes are made up of layers, and these layers generally take up the entire screen, and they're usually, this is where the event handling stuff happens, so the touches and the accelerometer stuff, which if you remember from last time, the events that we were getting, there are two types of events. They're either motion events or accelerometer events. So sort of the same thing happening here. And then layers can contain other layers and sprites, which we'll talk about in a second if you're not really 100% sure what sprites mean. And there are other things that can be added to layers. So buttons, like menus, for example, like we just saw in the tests there. So if you're not familiar with sprites, this is basically what they are. They're just a discrete set of images that if you play them back over time, you'll get this impression of animation. So if you've ever done any of those little flip books where you draw little stick figures or whatever it is you draw, if you're really good, you flip through them, you'll get some sort of animation. So in this case, we have this guy, I think his name is Grossini, who I think he's, I don't know, someone who's more into the dance scene than I am. This might be the Macarena, I don't know. But so he's got a few little moves, and if we were to go through these really quickly, it'd look like he's dancing around. Next up is the director. So the director is again, this is kind of, you can think of the movie analogy where the director sort of controls what's going on. In this case, our director manages moving between scenes. So you have you have your menu scene and you have your first level scene. Basically, the director is sort of what takes care of moving you from one place to the other. And usually what would happen is a layer would say, hey, I'm ready, because I'm ready to move on from here because of whatever logic's going on, so take me to this next scene. And then the director would actually go ahead and do that. And it's also in charge of pausing and running the scenes. And then in terms of on startup, the director is what sets up OpenGL ES, which is what we're running on top of. So again, as you learn more about OpenGL, probably the defaults are fine for a lot of the stuff that people are doing, but if you find that performance is lacking or you need some special something, it's through the director that you can well, you can tweak a few things and you can access OpenGL pretty much at any time. And I already mentioned this, but usually it's the layer that asks the director to move on, and that's just because, just sort of a natural, it's just kind of the way the application ends up being set up, that if your characters, your sprites are running around in the layer, at some point, when they step on the fire and, I don't know, bad things happen to them, then, it might be, the logic for transitioning to the death scene would be right there, and the layer would say, hey, director, let's move on to this cutscene. So here's some images from some of the Cocos documentation, where on the left we've got this game. Well, we've got our menu scene, and that menu scene happens to be made up of a number of different layers. It has this background layer. They have this animation layer where they have this coconut thing. So that used to be the icon, or the icon for Cocos 2D. It's gotten fancier lately, as you may have seen at the start. But and then you have this, this menu layer where you have various menu items that when you click on them will transition you off to some other scene. And the thing that's cool is with scenes, you have a lot of these neat transitions. So these weird swipe effects and, like shatter effects and, fade ins, fade outs. So you can get all, cinematic. All right, so let's look at, so that was kind of the high level Cocos 2D. So we've got scenes with layers, and layers we deal with interaction, and then we've got sprites that hang out in layers, and we've got the director that sort of manages sort of everything. In terms of the specifics, so I just really like this picture. So one of the things which, if you haven't seen it yet, inside Xcode, you can grab some code, and might as well do it and see. You can, well, I'll just, well, I won't actually do it, but you can grab some code, and then in design, you can go up to class model, and you can do quick model. And what it will do is it'll look through the stuff you've selected or through the project, and it'll create a hierarchy of basically how all the inheritance hierarchy, so you can see how the various objects are connected to each other, if they have protocols defined, and we'll look shortly as we move through the code. So I just, for me, I'm a visual person. I like seeing pictures, and I was curious. I wanted to see how Cocos 2D was set up, and there are two different views. The view I chose to show here, I chose because it's pretty to me. There's another one where it's more flat, so it looks it's less cluttered. But the point is, I think we could spend an entire quarter or more on Cocos 2D by itself, and not just Cocos 2D, but Cocos 2D and game programming and 2D game programming. There's a lot of stuff there. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to highlight a few of the classes that are going to be very important for you from the very beginning. So kind of start with these classes that I show you, and then you can expand into all these other wonderful classes that do all sorts of great things for you. So the important classes, so we've got Cocos Node, Scene, which we've talked about, but we'll look at more closely, the layer, the director. We'll look at AtlasSprite and AtlasSprite Manager. So we've talked about a sprite, but we haven't really talked about an Atlas sprite. And we'll look at that and very briefly sort of, see what the distinction is and why it matters. So the Cocos node. So here, what I did is I went through and I selected some of the things that I thought were important. I ran that class model thing, and it generated this guy here. And so we see Cocos node. Basically, it inherits off of an NS object, like most of our Objective-C things do. And then it seems like there are some private methods implemented in a category, which I think I showed folks last time very briefly how to do that, or a time before. And then the sort of pinkish stuff at the bottom, basically this is how you see that we have a bunch of protocols defined. So some of your classes can adopt these protocols. Maybe you want to adopt the Cocos node frames protocol because that's important for what you're doing. In terms of what the Cocos node actually does or is, it basically has tons of properties. It's the place, again, since most things are going to be Cocos nodes, chances are you're going to need some of these properties that it has here. So position, scale. There's a camera associated with every Cocos node. There's an OpenGL Z position, which could be useful for doing some things. And then every Cocos node can have children. So basically what's going to end up happening as you create your scenes and layers and do all these things, you're going to have this graph, this tree structure of Cocos nodes where your node is a parent, is a child of well, for example, if you add sprites to a scene, or to a layer, for example, well, the layer is your parent, and maybe that layer has 10 sprites associated with it. And I mentioned this already, most objects will in Cocos 2D inherit from Cocos 2D or from Cocos node. So next up is scene, and the scene is probably the simplest class in Cocos 2D. It pretty much does nothing, and many people they just sort of use it because they have to. And as you look through some of the examples, actually, if you think back to the example I just showed, which you may have already forgotten, but there was a point where there was scene, node, and then the next thing was adding a child. So the scene, add child, and then there was that next callback thing where it was getting the class and then calling node. Yeah, the scene doesn't do much, but it's sort of what's used as this thing to help you transition from one thing to another. I actually use it, and I'll make a quick aside here, I use it as a structural element. So for me, because each of these scenes makes up a distinct part of the game, a level or a high score screen, the main screen, for the stuff I've done, I've used scene as this high level place where my model objects might be stored here in the scene, and then because the scene, I then let the scene sort of manage the creation of the layers and the other things below, and I don't know, I found that useful. And then again, as transitioning from place to place, I don't know, I found it useful to just put my things in the scene. And just let the layers. I like to have my code be as small as possible. I don't like to have these huge, ginormous classes with stuff, so I try to put things sort of in whatever little compartment I think they can go in and not clutter stuff. The layer, again, here's how this one looks. There's a bunch of stuff. It inherits off Cocos node. If you look very closely, you'll see something about a UI accelerometer delegate. So again, if you're going to use the accelerometer, the layer is sort of what will help you take care of that. Which, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I was going to say, you don't actually have to do this interaction, user interaction. You don't have to use the layer. And in fact, I've done stuff where my sprites will say they'll adopt some sort of touch delegate because it makes more sense for me to have the interaction happen with the sprite. But here it is. This is the layer and some of the things associated with it. You'll see that there are a few classes that inherit off of the layer. There's a multiplex layer and a color layer. I haven't messed with either of them, but sounds fairly descriptive. Color layer probably does stuff with color. Multiplex layer probably lets me multiplex or choose between a number of different layers. And we could look to see if we wanted. In terms of the director, it turns out we actually have a number of directors. Of course, when you're running, your chances are you'll be using only one of them. And basically, when it comes to the directors, so I guess I didn't mention it, and I should step back for a second. So for folks that aren't familiar with game programming, most games are implemented. Most games have something called a game loop, and that game loop is run, every 60th of a second or every 30th of a second. So right, you want something that looks very responsive, or is responsive, so you want it to run at 60 frames a second or 30 frames a second. So this game loop, basically this is where it's sort of your chance to gather the input. So okay, so say accelerometer stuff or touch input, you gather that input and you try to process it and do something with it. Maybe you have things that need, you need to check for collision detection. So so you gather input, check for collision detection, update the artificial intelligence stuff that's going on, do whatever other physics needs to be done, draw the scene, and repeat. So the director sort of controls that. It has, it sort of sets up this game loop which you get to kind of attach to separately in your own code. So the thing is, as far as, I mentioned that, maybe you're running your game at 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second, or that's what you would like to run it at. Well, it turns out that there are a number of different ways to try and squeeze out the most performance of the iPhone. And there's this timer-based way. There's a threaded one if you're going to do stuff with threading. And each of these sort of behave differently depending on what you want to do with UIKit. So say you want to use Cocos 2D, but you also want to use some of the UIKit stuff. You want to use the buttons that are there, the sliders, the whatever. Depending on the director you choose, it may or may not operate or behave nicely with UIKit. And if you look, it's in the code. It's actually they very clearly say, okay, here's use this if you plan on using stuff with UIKit. Don't use this if you don't. For now, look through the code. You'll know which one you want to use as you move along, but just start with whatever the sample is using, and don't worry, you'll know when it becomes important. Okay, so AtlasSprite, this is another class that's going to be important, and we'll look at what an AtlasSprite is in a second, but again, just mentioning that as you look through these things and you're working on games, this is one of the classes that will be important. And then the AtlasSprite Manager, they work with AtlasSprites, and we'll look at what AtlasSprites are shortly, probably right now. So Sprite versus an AtlasSprite. So we saw sprites, right? There are these individual images hanging out, and we somehow flip through them and we get animations. AtlasSprite's pretty much the same thing, except all the images are in one image right now, and usually we refer to that as an atlas, a texture atlas. And so what happens in this case, you see I've got a bunch of images with Grossini here, and maybe those top two rows are for him dancing, and then this bottom row is for some other special thing where his head does whatever, and maybe that's not associated with the dancing. So you can think of those first two rows as being part of his dance animation sequence, and then this other row is part of his head rolling sequence, which you show when he loses the game or whatever happens. I don't know. And then also I stuck the word AtlasSprite in there because you could shove text, which you would put text and all sorts of other things, and to see that all the images don't have to be the same size that are in there. So this is just a big image with all of your other images, and the AtlasSprite and the AtlasSprite Manager basically let you work with your sprites in this form. And why is that important? Well, in general, it's because of performance issues. So under the hood, OpenGL is doing all sorts of stuff. And when you're using sprites, and each of those sprites are their own individual image, for those of you, some of you are learning all sorts of good stuff about OpenGL right now in Ken's 175 class. For those of you that haven't, OpenGL is this big state machine where you kind of turn some knobs, you feed it some data, and then you draw your stuff. And the drawing that comes out is based on this state that you've set. The problem is if you're constantly resetting the states, that's going to slow things down. So when you're using a sprite, you have a bunch of these images, and when it's time to draw, basically, you might be kicking images out of graphics memory and just slowing things down, whereas with an AtlasSprite, you might be able to put everything in memory once, and now you're just changing some texture coordinates or some indices into that image to access your things. So at the end of the day, when you look through the samples, don't worry, but when you're writing the stuff you're going to write, chances are you're going to want to use AtlasSprites. And that question comes up all the time, and that's why, if you remember from those first few slides on the forum, AtlasSprite Manager and whatever, people are still talking about it. Yeah, and the question comes up all the time: why do I want to use AtlasSprite Manager or AtlasSprites versus Atlas or versus Sprites? So, main reason is performance. Okay, so we've got 15 minutes. We're going to fly through some of the samples that that you have available to you, and you can go back through these on your own a little slower and see how some things work. Any questions while I find what I need to find? Yes?
Are there any artificial intelligence type?
I don't think I've seen any sort of AI stuff in there, but chances are if you find a library, an open source one, if it's in C, C++, you'll be able to use it, no problem. All right, so let's start with Hello World for Cocos. And I'm going to live on the wild side and not check. All right, I can't. I got to check. All right, and that was set. Okay. So Hello World, I expect it to say hello of some sort. Ta-da! All right. So Hello World in Cocos 2D. So let's take a quick look at the .h. Basically, it should look fairly similar to a lot of the other applications you've seen, right? We've got, some sort of UI application delegate. There's some sort of window. In this case, they were a little sloppy and put this other interface stuff here in this .h. So we see we have a class Hello World, and it inherits off of a layer. So remember, layers, we can control, do some sort of interaction and add stuff to them. So if we go over to the implementation, and let's start at application did finish launching. So the first thing that's going to end up happening is you're going to, so I showed how there were a number of different directors. The first thing you're going to do is actually choose some type. And they happen to choose this one, and you can dive into the code and see what this one's about. And it'll tell you here, okay, director type thread main loop. You've got some features faster than NS timer. That could be useful for what you're doing. But has the caveat that it doesn't integrate nicely with UIKit objects. Okay. So, all right, so we set up our director, do some, in this case, we're allocating our window. So before, we've sort of had interface builder where we had our window in that nib file. In this case, we're actually allocating it, init with frame, and then we're doing that thing that I couldn't remember how to do last week, right, where we ask this UI screen for the main screen, and then we get its bounds. So now we have some sort of frame for our window. And basically, because director is sitting on top of OpenGL, it's set up its OpenGL view. So we have a number of views that we've worked with. There also happens to be an OpenGL, or there's one that's associated with OpenGL. It's called EAGL view. And what we're doing is, so the director, there's only one director, and it's a singleton object. So, basically we're saying grab that object and shove it in this window. Set up some sort of orientation for the director. So in this case, it's landscape left. This we've seen in the other apps where we tell the window to make key invisible to basically make it visible. And then finally we get to sort of, the stuff I was talking about where, the scene, there isn't much going on with the scene. In this case, we've got our scene, and we say, hey, scene, give me a node. So this is just going to allocate a node, a scene for us, and it's auto-released. And the next thing we're doing is we're going to create a Hello World node, and we'll look inside Hello World in a second to see what it does. Happens to be a layer. They didn't, it inherits off the layer. But so we've got our Hello World node, and now we have our scene that we created, and we say scene, add child, layer. And then we tell the director to go ahead and run with that scene. So nothing too fancy there, given that we understand that scenes contain layers, and we'll see what's inside the layer in a second. Yes?
When you first started the application, there was that goes to the welcome screen or that loading screen.
Yes.
I didn't see that in here. Is there something turning before that, or is that part of the scene?
So something we haven't talked about yet is there's an image called default.png, and whatever you make that image on startup, that's what you'll see while the application is sort of loading and doing its thing. And you can, I think you can change the name of that inside an info plist file, but that's where that's coming from. So let's look at the Hello World class and see what it's actually doing, or the implementation. So basically, when we call node, at some point it's going to actually alloc and init, and that's when this stuff is going to get called. So first things first, the usual, right? We're inheriting off someone, so give them a chance to initialize. In this case, we're giving the layer a chance, which is giving the Cocos node a chance to set up whatever it needs to set up. So this thing says Hello World. So basically, Cocos has a label, which you can create by saying label with string, and tell it Hello World, and you can give it a font. In this case, we gave it marker felt, and there's some list somewhere where you can see this is a standard iPhone font, so you can look someplace and see what the list of available fonts are. Next up, basically they're just saying, hey, how big is the director? And if you remember right, the size was this struct that had width and height, and we saw that when we were looking at frames and bounds and all that other good stuff with UI views. So we get the size, and basically the only reason we got the size is so that we could divide the width and the height by 2 and position, and set the label at some particular position. And CCP is just some macro that ends up calling CG point make, which is something from core graphics. So we get some position, and then we say self. So since we're a Cocos node, we can have children. We can say self add child label. And so at this point, the layer has added a label to it, and the this Hello World thing was added to the scene, and then we saw what we saw. So we've got about 7 minutes. Let's see, we might be able to get through one more of the examples. So hello UCD. Yay UCD. All right. That's right. School spirit. All right, so next up, Hello Actions. So Cocos has a number of very useful things. One of them is called actions, and actions are basically, you can tell sprites to do stuff. Say, hey, sprite, I want you to move there, or move by this amount, or do this or that. So let's take a look at what this sample does for us, and then we'll look and see how it does it. So hello actions. And just because someone on the video at some point will be looking, make sure that this thing is set. Okay. So what do we see here? We saw hello actions, and it scaled up, and then we see Grossini doing some thing I would never do on my head, but he's bouncing around. So let's see how Grossini is doing what it is that he is doing, and now he's done. So, all right, so hello actions.h. So same sort of stuff. We'll skip over up here. The application delegate type stuff. And then, again, they're setting up a layer called hello actions, and it's just inheriting off layer. There's nothing inside of it. And we'll start again with the application did finish launching. So same thing, right? Grab your director and set its type. I left this out last time, but basically there was a new fancy thing that was added to SDK 3.1, which let you synchronize with essentially this vertical synchronization on the phone. So it's just much nicer and faster. And so if it's available, we want to use it. If not, they've decided to use this threaded one. Same stuff, initialize the window, grab the director and attach it inside the window. So remember, the director actually has got our OpenGL view stuff. And again, set the orientation left. And the stuff we've seen before in the last example. So we've got a scene that we create our layer, we add the layer to the scene, and then we tell the director to go ahead and run with the scene. So the thing that's interesting for us right now is hello actions, because that's where we've got some code. And let's see what we've got going on here. So it looks like a lot of things going on, but okay, so initialize our parents. So first up, the label. So we just saw how to create a label, right? We can say label with string hello actions, and so this is pretty much the same thing we just saw, where we create a label and position it somewhere on the screen. And because this label right now is just hanging out, not doing anything, if we actually want it to show up, we need to add it as one of our children. So you saw how we created the label, right? It was just, we're using this class method, this label with string. So this means that it's being auto-released. So we can infer that when we do this add child, the Cocos node is somehow retaining a copy of it, which under the hood it's some sort of NS array, and when you add things into NS arrays, the retain count increases. So that's fine. That'll stick around for us. So here's our action. In this case, let's see. So remember, actions tell things what to do. And in this case, we're saying, let's create an action called scale by, and that action, scale by, action with duration, 3 seconds, and then scale, over those 3 seconds, scale by a factor of 2.5. And then basically the way you end up using them is you say, hey, label, do what I say. In this case, run action, which is the action we just created, that scale by. And we can do the same thing with a sprite, where in this case, so we're using a sprite instead of an AtlasSprite, but sprite with file, and basically by doing this is going to look for grossini.png, which is somewhere in the resources folder, similar to our other applications. So we're going to position our sprite, and we're going to add the sprite to the layer. And what we can do, so when we add the child to ourselves, we can also give it a Z ordering. And this is just, to sort of put things in front of or behind things, which might be useful depending on what you want obscured or occluded or not. So for Grossini, we're going to do a number of things. Basically, we're going to create a few actions, and then we're going to kind of link them together. And we've got 48 seconds. So let's see how to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is a rotate by. So that sounds pretty descriptive. So rotate for a duration of 4 seconds over 180 times 4 degrees. And then let's also make a jump action. Again, it's going to be over 4 seconds, and it's going to have some sort of, it's going to start at some place, and it's going to go so high, and there's going to be 4 jumps as it does it. So Cocos takes care of making all that stuff for us, and then the next thing is we create this spawn thing, which is sort of how we can tie a number of actions together. So we'll do the spawn and give it the two actions, so the rotate action and the jump action, and then usually when you can take a number of different things, you end it with nil, and that's sort of how it'll know that it's done looking for stuff. And then the nice thing with actions is that you can run them in one direction, and you can just call reverse on them and run them in the opposite direction. So that's what they're doing here. We're taking the spawn, which is our actions, and saying, okay, well, give them to me in reverse. And then next up is we can create a sequence of actions. So we've got our forward actions, our backwards one, and we put them in the sequence. And you have another type of action, this repeat thing, where basically you can give it the stuff that you want to repeat, tell it how many times to do it. And so kind of just getting all that stuff together, eventually you can say, hey Sprite, run the action repeat. And it's going to do all of those things that we sort of group together. So there was one more, hello events, which shows you more of pretty much the stuff we saw recently, which is stuff like touches began, touches ended, same sort of stuff going on in here. And I'll just show you that little snippet just to see. So you should look through that one at some point. And so same sort of stuff, right? Sets of touches, events, and let me put these up just so they're there. So the resources, cocos2d-iphone.org, where you can get everything you need and look at documentation and forums. Other resources, there's a wiki there where you can look at various bits of documentation and whatnot, and the forums, which are always useful. And people are very friendly and helpful. So that's it. And I think there are a number of you doing games, so have fun with that. Okay, I think we are ready.